Hello everyone. Tonight we're entering a life that made sense to entire nations for centuries, and yet baffled colonizers so badly they wrote about it like it was witchcraft. This is the story of the Two-Spirit, a person seen not as broken, but as doubled, carrying balance in a world where survival depended on balance. Imagine being born and immediately treated like a message from the cosmos. Your grandmother insists the way you reached for the wrong hand means you're destined for something extraordinary. Your name is chosen not just to identify you, but to pin you into the map of the spirit world. And long before you can walk, people are already whispering that you don't just belong to one role, you belong to two, and maybe more. Your life is filled with contradictions that somehow fit perfectly together. You're sewing beadwork so intricate it looks like it was done with divine eyesight. Then riding into battle carrying bundles warriors swear will tip the odds. You're blessing crops in the morning, telling stories at night that children lean into like flames. And somewhere in between, you're expected to keep the entire community from splitting apart over a feud about water rights. And then there's marriage. In a world where missionaries shrieked about sin, your people had already accepted that your partner wasn't scandalous. They were blessed for choosing you. Your union wasn't rebellion, it was another stitch in the fabric of survival. That's the life we're stepping into tonight. A life both celebrated and attacked, honored and outlawed, silenced and then revived centuries later in the voices of people who refused to let erasure win. So, if you enjoy a strange story told as if it were happening to you, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if this really is your cup of tea. I'd rather you disappear now than suffer through 40 minutes of sleepy sarcasm later. And tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? I love seeing the comments filled with night owls in New York, early risers in Lisbon, and insomniacs in São Paulo, all listening to the same story together. Now, set the stage around you, let the lights fall low, maybe pour something warm, tea, cocoa, or whatever your grandmother swore would keep away bad dreams. Let the hum of your fan or the rumble of your city fade into background rhythm. We're about to step back, not into fantasy, but into a history that carried two spirits and never quite let go of either. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine it, instead of popping out under fluorescent lights while someone in Crocs announces your weight, you arrive in a world where the first thing people look for isn't your APGAR score, but whether the spirits had a plan for you. In some native nations, a birth was never just a baby screaming. It was a social event, a cosmic memo, and sometimes a divine comedy. Elders and midwives watched for quirks. Maybe you cried with an oddly musical pitch. Maybe you grasped the wrong hand, left instead of right. Maybe you stared a little too long at the fire, like you were reading subtitles no one else could see. These weren't accidents, they were signs. And in a culture where nothing about existence was random, a sign meant destiny. Now, while other newborns are being swaddled and told they're just perfect, you'd already be quietly filed under a special category. Not quite boy, not quite girl, something else entirely. People might not say it outright at first, but your grandmother, the one who claims she can talk to birds, is already telling anyone who listens that you've got a different spirit walking with you. And everyone listens, because grandmothers in these societies weren't just background furniture with knitting needles. They were oracles with impeccable accuracy. You see, in many tribes across the plains, the Southwest, the Great Basin, and beyond, there was a recognition that gender wasn't two neat boxes you ticked with a Sharpie. It was a spectrum of roles, responsibilities, and, inconveniently for later missionaries, spirits. A child who seemed to cross or blend those lines wasn't shamed or hidden away. They were marked out for a life that involved carrying more than their share of the metaphysical baggage. Lucky you. And don't imagine this was done with any subtlety. Birth omens could be as small as which direction the wind blew when you first opened your lungs, or as dramatic as an animal wandering through the camp that night. If a hawk landed on the lodgepole, you were destined for visions. If a coyote started howling nearby, well, congratulations, you were spiritually complicated. Your parents might not know whether to be proud, worried, or just relieved you weren't twins, because twins, in some traditions, carried their own brand of divine paperwork. By the time you're toddling around, everyone's watching you like you're an early draft of prophecy. If you insist on copying the tasks of your opposite-sex siblings, say, a boy reaching for the awl and sinew instead of the bow, people don't scold you. They nod knowingly. They whisper. They remember. That's how recognition began. Not with you announcing anything, but with the community recognizing that your path bent in a different direction. And here's the eerie part. In societies that valued survival, every role mattered. So the presence of a child who blurred gender roles wasn't a threat. It was insurance. You were going to carry skills, rituals, maybe even powers that no one else could. It wasn't about being special in a sparkly birthday cake way. It was about being useful to the cosmos, and therefore to the people. By the time you're old enough to stop chewing on everything that looks remotely edible, you already have a name. Not the kind scribbled on a birth certificate and immediately shortened into a nickname your parents regret later, but a name with weight. Among many native nations, names aren't just convenient labels so people can yell at you across the field. They're instructions, they're shields, they're declarations of who you are supposed to be in the great, exhausting soap opera between humans and spirits. Now, if you've been spotted as a two-spirit child, your name might carry an extra layer of meaning. It could refer to a dream your relative had about you, something involving animals, thunder, or a particularly talkative ancestor who refused to stay quiet in the afterlife. It might mark you as someone who walks in two worlds, the physical and the spiritual, the masculine and the feminine. And unlike the modern horror of being named after a car brand or a fruit, these names weren't embarrassing. They were sacred. They shaped the way people treated you long before you had the chance to mispronounce them yourself. But here's the twist. Names in many indigenous societies weren't fixed forever. You could be renamed as you grew, as visions came, as you accomplished things. So imagine living in a system where your identity wasn't locked at 5 letters, but continuously upgraded like some spiritual software patch. For a two-spirit person, that meant the community could mark your path again and again, publicly affirming that yes, you're not just an odd child, your life belongs to a pattern larger than the rest of us. Socially, this came with both perks and peculiarities. In cultures like the Lakota, Navajo, or Zuni, there was an understanding that your place wasn't measured by fitting into boy tasks or girl tasks. Instead, you occupied a recognized third category. That meant when others were shelved toward rigid training, boys sharpening arrows, girls grinding corn, you were often invited to learn both. Not because anyone was confused, but because you were expected to hold more. More skills, more stories, more responsibility. Congratulations! Your childhood is now an unpaid internship for cosmic balance. And don't think this was some quiet arrangement kept in the family. The whole community recognized it. Ceremonies, gatherings, even gossip circles. Your difference was spoken of as destiny. Elders might point you out to visiting relatives. This child will carry two spirits. It wasn't whispered like a scandal. It was announced like the weather. People needed to know, because your role was going to ripple through kinship, ritual, and politics. Still, that didn't mean life was one long round of applause. Expectations cling to you like smoke. Every move you made became symbolic. If you chose to wear clothing of the opposite sex, people read it as affirmation of your spiritual path. If you handled tools or sacred items from another role, it was considered not transgression but fulfillment. Your life was commentary, and people were constantly interpreting the text. Forget privacy, every habit becomes anthropology in real time. And here's the irony. While European settlers would later stumble in and obsessively enforce rigid binaries, your people already had a nuanced system that made room for complexity. They didn't need pamphlets, laws, or awkward HR workshops. They had names, rituals, and categories centuries deep. You were never outside. You were folded in, slotted into the social fabric like an essential stitch. But recognition through naming and placement is only the opening act. Because soon, those names stop being just words whispered at ceremonies. They start dictating what you actually do. And that means moving beyond identity into the hard, daily labor of gender roles that don't obey anyone's rulebook. So here you are, already carrying a name that feels like it should echo in a canyon. And now the real fun begins. Daily life. In most cultures, childhood means being gently shoved into one lane. Either you're expected to sharpen arrows until your fingers blister or grind corn until your back aches. Not you. Being two-spirit means you're thrown into both lanes at once, like some cosmic multi-tool nobody bothered to give a brake button. One morning, you're out with the boys, learning to track deer, how to walk so softly the grass forgets you were ever there. By afternoon, you're sitting with the women, threading quills, tanning hides, and listening to stories passed down through hands as much as words. The point isn't confusion, the point is coverage. You're expected to embody a balance, to know how to sustain life and defend it, how to hunt and how to heal. Your body might be small, but the job description is endless. And let's be clear, people notice. When you sit at the loom or bend over beadwork, no one snickers and says, "That's not for you." When you join in a dance, usually reserved for one gender, the elders don't drag you off the floor. Instead, the act is taken as proof that your spirit has its own choreography. You're performing a different kind of order, one the community has seen before and expects to see again. This doesn't mean it's easy. Imagine every child around you getting to specialize, while you're drafted into being a walking liberal arts education. They get neat, narrow tracks. You get double majors and no days off. If that sounds exhausting, that's because it was. But here's the twist. This wide training also made you indispensable. In a society where survival depended on every pair of hands, being able to move across roles wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. You became the flexible hinge in a door. Everyone else insisted on opening the same way. And what about clothing? Forget the boring binary of tunics for boys, dresses for girls. Two-spirit people often mixed elements, combining styles in ways that made colonizers clutch their rosaries centuries later. Among the Navajo, for example, Nadli might wear a mixture of male and female garments. Among the Lakota, Winked often adorned themselves in elaborate dresswork that proclaimed their distinct role. Clothing wasn't fashionable. It was theology stitched in fabric, a walking proclamation that gender wasn't about conformity but about balance. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Rival children sometimes tried to jab at your difference, though their parents usually hushed them quickly. You weren't just another kid to tease. You were spiritually marked. Mocking you could risk cosmic backlash, and no one wanted to explain to the cornfield why it suddenly failed that year. Respect didn't always come from kindness. Sometimes it came from fear. So daily life meant living as both hunter and weaver, protector and nurturer. The village saw you not as undecided, but as doubled. Your path wasn't in between, it was across. You contradicted the way other children carried toys. And every time you sat down to bead, or rose to join a hunt, you were reenacting a worldview that said balance was not a compromise but a blessing. And yet, the role didn't stop at tasks, because soon enough, you'd discover that being two-spirit wasn't only about who you were in the village. It was about how you walked into the invisible world, how you served as a bridge where others saw walls. By now you've realized that your chores aren't the endgame. They're just the warm-up act. Because being two-spirit isn't simply about what you do with your hands, it's about what everyone believes is happening inside your chest. People don't look at you and think, oh, a child with unusual interests. They think, there's a person carrying two spirits, two currents, maybe even two sets of instructions from the universe. Congratulations, you've just been drafted as a part-time mystic, whether you asked for it or not. You see, in many indigenous nations, gender wasn't a static category, but a sign of cosmology. To live outside the binary wasn't a glitch, it was a signal that you could walk more easily in the spiritual world. The Lakota winked, the Navajo Nadli, the Zuni Lamana. These weren't just social roles, they were spiritual callings. People believed you had access to powers, visions, or insights that others couldn't quite touch. Which sounds wonderful, until you realize what it means. You can't really have a lazy Tuesday. Even your dreams are considered public property. Let's say you wake up from a vision of a bird carrying fire. That isn't just your subconscious being dramatic. That's suddenly the council's business. Was it an omen for war? A sign for harvest? Or maybe just indigestion? Either way, you'll be asked about it. People will listen, scribble it into memory, and expect you to interpret the divine. Try shrugging and saying, I don't know, not an option. You'll learn quickly that vague metaphors are your best defense. And it doesn't stop at dreams. Two-spirit individuals were often associated with healing. You might be called to handle medicine bundles, to learn chants, to treat the sick. Not because you went to med school, but because your spiritual identity made you the logical bridge between human pain and cosmic remedy. Imagine being 12 years old and someone brings you their feverish cousin with the expectation that your touch might be halfway between earth and sky. No pressure. Ritual, too, becomes your playground or your cage, depending on the day. In some ceremonies, two spirits were called to lead dances, to bless hunts, or to prepare sacred items. The logic was simple. If you embodied duality, then you embodied balance, and balance was what the world needed most. But try telling that to your tired feet after 6 hours of ritual dance under the sun. Cosmic balance is heavy, especially when you're carrying it with sore ankles. The eerie part is how naturally people accepted this. In European frameworks, someone outside rigid gender roles was branded deviant. In these communities, you were branded necessary. And not necessary in the sense of background support, but necessary in the sense of the crops might fail if you don't show up. It's a peculiar kind of power, one that feels more like responsibility than privilege. So your life becomes threaded with the unseen. Every step is watched for signs, every dream mined for meaning, every gesture weighed as ritual. Even laughter isn't just laughter, it's read as whether the spirits are pleased. You become a walking omen, a mediator, a living question mark in human form. And the thing about being a question mark is that eventually people start asking you to resolve conflicts no one else can, which means your role doesn't stay confined to ceremonies. It spills into the messiest part of human life, politics, disputes, and the daily need for someone who can walk in two worlds at once. Picture yourself sitting cross-legged, not on some yoga mat bought in bulk, but on a buffalo hide stretched tight, a bone all in your hand, and a pile of porcupine quills that seem to multiply every time you blink. This is where your reputation begins. In many tribes, two-spirit people became renowned for the kind of work that made survival beautiful beadwork. Quillwork, hides cut and stitched so finely that the seams looked less like labor and more like prayer. These weren't hobbies, they were the public face of your spirit, stitched into garments and objects that outlived you. Craftwork wasn't just decoration, it was economics, politics, and cosmology all woven into one. The shirt you made might end up on a chief's shoulders during negotiations. The robe you tanned could drape across the body of a dancer at a winter ceremony. Every bead you pressed into sinew wasn't just ornament, it was testimony. Communities survived through craft, and two-spirit artisans often became the keepers of its highest forms. You weren't simply making clothes, you were making memories. This reputation carried its own double edge. On the one hand, your work was treasured. People came to you for designs they claimed were guided by visions. On the other, being known for excellence meant you never really had an off day. Imagine being halfway through a blanket and thinking, good enough didn't exist. If you botched a pattern, someone was bound to whisper that maybe your spirits were displeased. Quality control, in your case, was a divine mandate. Beyond craft, there was the quieter but equally demanding work of preparation. You might be asked to ready hides for sacred use, to paint symbols onto objects bound for ceremony, or to create ritual bundles. These tasks weren't passed out casually. They required precision, patience, and above all, trust. And two-spirit people often became the holders of that trust, not only because of skill, but because their dual identity was seen as stabilizing, a way of ensuring the work carried balance. This specialization spilled into performance too. Think of dancers, not as entertainment, but as living technologies. Steps mattered, hand gestures mattered, the way you carried an object mattered. Some two-spirits were dancers, others singers, others builders of instruments. The line between labor and ritual blurred until your daily tasks became half craft, half ceremony. The community relied on that blurring because it reinforced the idea that survival wasn't only about food and shelter. It was also about meaning stitched into the fabric of life. And the irony, while colonial chroniclers later scribbled in their journals about strange men in women's roles, they missed the point entirely. This wasn't a curiosity act. It was specialization, respected and necessary. When a war leader needed regalia, when a healer needed tools, when a festival needed its centerpiece, your name was on the list. And not because you were tolerated, because you were trusted. But this wasn't the end of your duties. Craft made you visible, yes, but it also positioned you for something far trickier, serving as the person everyone turned to when balance was off, when tempers flared, when two sides refused to meet in the middle. And that, inconveniently, required more than beadwork. It required diplomacy. Imagine the scene. Two families in the village are at each other's throats, arguing over land, water, or maybe whose nephew conveniently forgot the rules of a game that suspiciously ended in bruises. Normally, disputes like this could spiral, pulling in cousins, in-laws, and every uncle who thinks he's a strategist. But then someone remembers there's you, and suddenly, all eyes swivel to the person carrying two spirits. Two-spirit people often became mediators, not because they loved endless arguments, but because their position gave them credibility on both sides. You weren't locked into one gender's camp, and you weren't burdened with the same rivalries that ran through extended families like wildfire. Your dual identity made you a natural hinge, able to swing between perspectives. In cultures where balance wasn't a metaphor but a survival strategy, that role was invaluable. This wasn't conflict resolution in the modern HR sense, where someone forces you into a beige room to talk about feelings. It was diplomacy braided with spirituality. People trusted you not just to calm tempers, but to realign the situation with the broader order of things. If one side claimed defense, you could frame it in terms of disharmony, and disharmony wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. Crops, hunts, the weather itself could turn sour if humans lost their equilibrium. Sometimes your work was small, soothing bruised pride with a joke, or reminding everyone that the ancestors were probably watching and shaking their heads. Other times, it meant presiding over ceremonies designed to heal divisions. In both cases, your authority didn't come from brute force or bloodlines. It came from a recognition that you stood in between, which in these societies was not weakness but strength. The bridge building wasn't limited to conflicts. You were often the one linking men and women's spheres in daily life. Men might control hunts or warfare, women the hearth and food supply, but you could move between both without suspicion. That mobility gave you a broader overview of village life, and made you a quiet but effective channel for information, advice, and persuasion. If one group needed to understand the concerns of the other, you could translate, soften, or contextualize without being dismissed outright. This bridging role also extended to the spiritual world. Two spirits were often thought to hold clearer access to the unseen, which meant when disputes touched on ritual, whose responsibility was ignored, which offering had been botched, you were the one people trusted to interpret. Not always correctly, of course, but that was the beauty of metaphor. Say it with enough conviction, and it sounded like cosmic truth. The dry humor here is obvious. Your life as a two-spirit meant you couldn't simply sit on the sidelines, rolling dice and ignoring the mess. Your very identity shoved you into the role of referee. And unlike modern referees, you couldn't just blow a whistle and walk away. If the quarrel escalated, the village could fracture. And fractures in small-scale societies meant vulnerability. Mediation wasn't a nice aid-on, it was survival. Still, the price of being a bridge is that both sides walk across you. Respect came with weight, and weight left marks. You'd be trusted, yes, but also tested, sometimes resented, sometimes envied. And while you carried human tempers, you also carried another set of obligations, the sacred duties that marked you not just as mediator of disputes, but as keeper of rituals themselves. The ceremony arrives like the weather. It doesn't matter if you're tired, busy, or halfway through stitching a robe. When ritual calls, you go. For two-spirit people, this wasn't optional background noise, it was central. Communities across the continent understood you, not only as a social bridge, but as someone tethered directly to the spiritual order. And that meant a front-row seat, or more often, a starring role in sacred work. Take healing, for example. You might be asked to prepare medicines, chant over the sick, or help with rites of passage, not because you had a pharmacy tucked into your lodge, but because people trusted your in-between nature as a kind of spiritual antiseptic. Illness was rarely seen as random. It was imbalance, intrusion, or offense. Your dual identity made you the ideal person to coax harmony back into place. Imagine being 16 and someone hands you a rattle, a song, and the responsibility for their cousin's fever. That's not a teenage job. That's divine customer service. Death, too, carried your mark. In several nations, Two spirits were present in funerary practices, guiding the spirit of the dead or preparing the body. Death was not just departure, it was a fragile crossing. And who better to assist than someone already living in between? Your presence was reassurance that the transition wouldn't tilt too far one way. It sounds noble until you realize it also meant being called into rooms most others avoided. Rooms heavy with grief, incense, and silence. Certain ceremonies demanded your crafting skills. Sacred bundles, ritual clothing, objects used in dances, these often passed through your hands. Precision mattered, not as aesthetic choice but as spiritual safeguard. A misplaced bead could feel like a cosmic insult, so you worked with the patience of someone who knew even gods were picky critics. Again, no pressure. And then came initiation rites. Some tribes invited two spirits to bless adolescence, stepping into adulthood, to stabilize the turbulence of identity with your own embodied balance. You were living proof that categories could be crossed without catastrophe, which made you a reassuring and slightly intimidating figure for anyone terrified of the expectations waiting on the other side of puberty. The truth is, your role is blurred constantly. Sacred duties could mean tending fire in one season, interpreting dreams in another, dancing through ritual all night while others simply watched. This wasn't a part-time gig. It was woven into the rhythm of your life. Everyone else might measure their seasons by planting or hunting. You measured yours by ceremonies that demanded your presence. Colonial accounts, predictably, got this wrong. Missionaries wrote about two spirits with the horrified fascination of people who thought they'd found evidence of sin instead of evidence of nuance. They missed the point entirely. The sacred wasn't a side job you were allowed to do. It was the heart of why your community valued you. Without you, a ceremony felt incomplete, unbalanced, risky. Your absence was as telling as your presence. Of course, being indispensable comes with its own trap. When the whole community believes your hands steady the link between the living and the divine, there's no such thing as taking a break. You can't plead exhaustion or boredom. You perform, you bless, you sing, you heal. Even on days you'd rather disappear into the hills and scream at the sky. And yet, through this constant ritual labor, something else takes shape, a social respect that borders on awe. You may be exhausted, but you're also elevated, not just as worker or artisan, but as one whose very life is proof of the sacred. Respect in your world isn't the polite kind that comes from holding doors open. It's the kind carved into the bones of ceremony, reinforced every time people bow their heads when you pass. As a two-spirit person, you weren't simply tolerated, you were folded into the hierarchy of honor, sometimes even feared for the strange proximity you held to the unseen. Tik the Lakota winked. Their words were believed to carry spiritual weight, so much so that warriors sought their blessings before battle. Imagine the pressure of someone with a war club asking if your approval might tip the odds against arrows and spears. You say yes, and suddenly their courage hardens. You say no, and people wonder if the spirits already whispered defeat. That's not a casual influence. That's high-stakes charisma baked into your existence. The Navajo Nadali were likewise respected, not just for ceremonial roles, but for the way they embodied harmony. Balance was central to Navajo thought, and who embodied it better than someone who lived both masculine and feminine roles without contradiction? To outsiders, it looked like a paradox. To your people, it looked like cosmic symmetry. Honor could be expressed in public ways, gifts offered, seats given, voices silenced, so yours could be heard. Your presence at councils, feasts, and rituals wasn't incidental, it was expected. If your voice wasn't included, something felt off, like a drumbeat missing from the song. But this reverence had a double edge. Respect easily shaded into superstition. People sometimes stepped lightly around you, wary of offending the spirits thought to stand at your back. That meant deference, yes, but also distance. You might be praised openly, but whispered about privately. Honor and unease often traveled together, hand in hand. Colonial observers, naturally, twisted this. They wrote about two spirits as curiosities, fixating on clothing and behavior, blind to the fact that within their own nations, these people were often pillars of spiritual and social life. What Europeans dismissed as deviance was, in reality, recognition. Communities didn't place you on the margins, they placed you at the center, even when that position carried its own weight. There's humor in this if you squint. You, the person who never quite fit into one category, suddenly became indispensable because you fit into two. Everyone else lived in straight lines, you lived in a circle. And in societies where survival depended on balance with land, animals, weather, and spirit, the circle was what held everything together. Respect also meant your relationships were treated differently. A partner of a two-spirit person wasn't shamed in many cases. They were elevated, admired for choosing someone seen as doubly blessed. What later colonial morality branded as scandalous was, in its original context, often celebrated. You weren't seen as breaking rules. You were fulfilling a role sanctified by tradition. The eerie part of honor is how isolating it can be. Reverence creates space, but it also builds walls. People admired you, sought your counsel, asked for your blessings, but did they truly see you as an individual, or only as a vessel of balance? That's the paradox of respect. It elevates and distances at once, and still, you carried it, because with honor came responsibility, kinship roles that bound you even more tightly to the life of the community. You weren't just a figure of ceremony, you were part of the machinery of the family itself. Family, in your world, isn't the nuclear setup of mum-dad-kids-and-mortgage. It's an entire ecosystem of obligations, alliances, and jokes that never die. And if you're two-spirit, that ecosystem doesn't just include you, it rearranges itself around you. Kinship in indigenous societies was never casual. It was the architecture of survival, and you became one of its unusual but necessary beams. Let's start with children. In many tribes, two-spirit people were seen as natural caretakers, not because someone thought you'd be good with kids, but because you carried a dual spirit that made you uniquely qualified to raise the next generation. If an orphan needed a home, or a family was stretched too thin, you might step in as adoptive parent. And this wasn't charity, it was structure. Your role filled gaps, shored up weaknesses, kept families whole when they might otherwise fray. This made you more than a relative. You were a stabilizer, where others were defined by lineage. This side belongs to your father, that side belongs to your mother. You moved in between, linking households. People knew that if they trusted you with their child, that child would grow with double the perspective. The skills of both masculine and feminine, the stories of both sides of the circle. It was social insurance in human form. Marriage looked different, too. Partnerships with two-spirit individuals were not taboo in many tribes. They were acknowledged and respected. A man who married a two-spirit partner wasn't ridiculed. He was often considered fortunate. The union wasn't breaking rules. It was reinforcing them, affirming that life's balance required all its varied parts. In cultures that viewed sexuality and gender through cosmology rather than Victorian guilt, kinship with a two-spirit wasn't a scandal. It was a contribution to order. And then there were your responsibilities to elders. You might be called to help care for the aging, to keep their stories alive, to literally stitch memory into material objects. Kinship wasn't just about who you shared blood with, it was about who you served. Your role made you a bridge, not only between genders, but between generations. Of course, none of this was light work. Being woven into kinship meant there was no escape hatch. If someone needed a guardian, mediator, teacher, or surrogate, the answer was often you. Families leaned on you because they could. Communities leaned on you because they must. What looked like honor from the outside often felt like obligation from within. Colonial accounts rarely caught this. Missionaries saw two-spirit roles as strange aberrations, writing scandalized notes about unnatural unions, without noticing that the wider kinship system treated those unions as stabilizing, not threatening. They missed the fact that communities didn't see two spirits as detached oddities. They saw them as central gears in the kinship machinery, without which the whole thing would grind. And the humor in all this. Imagine everyone else in your extended family dodging responsibility while you're the so-called exception, end up carrying 3 nephews, a grandmother's stories, and half the spiritual obligations of the village. Congratulations, you're both sacred and overbooked. But kinship wasn't just about family obligations, it also extended into how your partnerships and marriages played out in the public eye, shaping not only your private life, but the political landscape of relationships themselves. Partnership for you isn't whispered about behind closed doors. It's out in the open, threaded into the social fabric like sinew through hide. In many native nations, unions with two-spirit people weren't treated as scandal or rebellion. They were recognized, expected, and in some cases, admired. Which means your love life, unlike most people's, wasn't a private experiment in awkwardness. it was another form of public service. If you took a husband, for instance, nobody clutched their pearls because you crossed a line. Among the Lakota, Crow, Navajo, and others, such a union was not only legitimate, but often elevated. The man who chose you wasn't mocked. He was praised for having the sense to partner with someone seen as doubly blessed. Your relationship was seen as carrying a weight larger than the two of you, a reinforcement of cosmic balance. Imagine the irony. Centuries later, colonizers would build entire moral panics around what your ancestors treated as common sense. Marriage didn't erase your social role, it expanded it. A two-spirit spouse could act as caretaker, mediator, or spiritual guide within a household, while also contributing economically. You weren't cloistered or diminished, you were integrated. Your partner gained not just a companion, but an ally with unusual authority. That kind of alliance reshaped kinship ties, and everyone knew it, which meant your bedchamber wasn't just about intimacy, it was also politics. This extended to how your unions were narrated. Oral traditions didn't erase these partnerships, they recorded them. Two-spirit figures in stories often appear as partners, parents, or advisors, their roles in love and kinship acknowledged as part of their sacredness. Your marriage wasn't an exception, it was an echo of a pattern older than memory. Of course, there was still gossip, not the "is this allowed" sort, but the everyday chatter that comes with visibility. If you showed affection in public, someone might interpret it as an omen. If your partner succeeded in a hunt or battle, people credited your blessing. If they failed, people wondered if you'd withheld it. Congratulations, your love life doubles as community weather report. Sexuality itself wasn't policed with the same rigid binaries later imported by missionaries. Instead, it was woven into the cycles of survival and spirituality. Who you partnered with mattered less than how that union sustained balance, kinship, and prosperity. The bed, like the hearth, was part of the communal architecture, and your role inside it wasn't hidden. It was folded into the larger pattern. And here's the dry punchline. What colonizers would later condemn as unnatural was, in its original context, one of the most natural things of all. Your unions worked not against tradition, but within it, reinforcing the principle that life required every kind of joining. You weren't the loophole in the system. You were part of the system's design. But if marriage rooted you inside kinship, it also opened the door to new responsibilities. Some carried into the hunt, some onto the battlefield, and some into the sacred spaces where survival wasn't measured only by affection, but by survival itself. You don't get to sit out when survival's on the line. If the hunters leave camp, you may find yourself with them, not always at the front with a bow, but carrying the rituals, songs, or bundles that gave the hunt its legitimacy. Among Plains nations, two-spirit people sometimes joined war parties, their presence believed to steady the group or call down favor. That's not tagging along. That's strategic deployment, the kind generals in other eras would kill for. But here's the twist. You weren't necessarily expected to fight in the conventional sense. You might not have been the one charging with a lance, but your role could be just as essential. Some two-spirits acted as scouts, interpreters of omens, or keepers of sacred items that had to be carried into battle. Imagine being handed a bundle, said to house the power of ancestors, and being told, "Don't drop it." That's not exactly less stressful than swinging a club. Among the Crow, the Bait, two-spirit individuals were known to ride with warriors, sometimes even taking captives or counting coup. Their courage was noted in oral histories, not as a curiosity but as fact. Participation in war was one more arena where your spiritual authority extended, not just at home, not just in ceremony, but on the field where life and death hung by a hair. In hunting, the pattern repeated. You might not be the one drawing the final arrow, but you were part of the process that made the hunt possible. Preparing ritual items, blessing weapons, or even participating directly in the chase. You were stitched into the logic of survival. Meat didn't just arrive. It had to be called, honored, balanced, and a two-spirit presence was often part of ensuring that balance. Now, let's pause on the irony. Later, colonizers saw two-spirits and assumed they were soft, unsuited for combat or survival. Yet here you were, sometimes on horseback in a raid, sometimes in the snow preparing buffalo hides, sometimes chanting before dawn to ensure the hunt went well. Not a spectator, not fragile. A participant in survival with duties as nerve-wracking as any spear thrust. the danger wasn't theoretical. If a battle went wrong, if a hunt failed, eyes turned to everyone involved, including you. Spiritual responsibility cuts both ways. You could be praised as the reason the hunt succeeded, or whispered about as the reason it failed. A broken bowstring, an empty trap, a sudden storm, all of it could be read as imbalance. And imbalance often got pinned on the people meant to carry harmony, which meant you. Still, the role was undeniable. Your presence at war or hunt wasn't a token gesture. It reinforced the idea that survival wasn't only physical but spiritual. Victory needed arrows, yes, but also balance. Food needed skill, yes, but also blessing. And you embodied that double necessity in a way no one else could. And once the dust settled, once the deer was skinned or the battle ended, another responsibility always followed. Telling the story, recording it in words, songs, or symbols. Because survival wasn't just measured in bodies fed or enemies defeated, it was measured in memory. And storytelling was one more place where your voice carried unusual weight. If battle and hunting gave you responsibilities in the physical world, storytelling handed you power in the invisible one. Because words, in your society, weren't just entertainment. They were medicine, law, archive, and spells rolled into one. And as a two-spirit person, your voice was often treated like it had an extra echo, carrying further than anyone else's. Imagine sitting at the fire while children lean closer, not because you bribed them with sweets, but because they believe your words hold more than human memory. You tell them of spirits who took human form, of ancestors who spoke through animals, of lessons wrapped in mischief and paradox. Your stories don't just pass time, they stitch order into chaos. Every tale is a thread, and the world is held together by how well you weave. Two-spirits appear in many traditions as culture heroes, guides, or tricksters, not because someone invented them for drama, but because they embodied lessons about the necessary complexity of life. Stories used your identity as metaphor, proof that life wasn't a neat binary of this or that, but a weaving of both. When people repeated those tales, they weren't just remembering, they were reaffirming the worldview that gave you your place. Sometimes your storytelling carries ritual weight. A chant spoken at the right time, in the right rhythm, could turn from tale into prayer. Words became bridges. You weren't just telling children how a coyote stole fire. You were making sure fire kept burning in the hearth. That overlap between narrative and necessity made your tongue a tool as sharp as any blade. And let's not romanticize it into pure glory. Storytelling comes with risk. Words misused could offend, disrupt, or even curse. If you told the wrong story at the wrong time, people noticed. Laughter could curdle into unease. The community trusted you to know, not just the tales, but when and how they were safe to release. You weren't a casual entertainer. You were an operator in the high-stakes economy of memory. The irony is that while European chroniclers obsessively wrote things down, assuming their ink would outlast your people's voices, it was often your oral tradition that proved more enduring. Your stories survived in memory, passed hand to hand, to fire, long after paper rotted. And two spirits weren't marginal in that chain. They were often its strongest links. Picture this. Winter evenings, snow packed tight against the lodges. Everyone gathered close. The old ones start a story, but then they pass the thread to you. And when you pick it up, people listen differently. They expect more. They expect balance, paradox, humor, revelation. They expect the kind of voice that can say, yes, the world is complicated, and that's exactly why it works. And when the story ends, no one claps. That's not how it works. They sit a moment in silence, letting it settle, as if the words themselves need space to find their place. Because words weren't disposable. They hung in the air, carried into the marrow of everyone who heard them. Yet storytelling wasn't just about the village's inner life. It also became the place where conflict with outsiders took root. Because when colonizers arrived, they didn't just bring muskets and missions. They brought a narrative, one that clashed violently with the stories you carried. The first time outsiders laid eyes on you, they didn't see balance or blessing. They saw scandal. Missionaries arrived with their pocket Bibles and their inability to handle complexity. And suddenly your existence was rewritten as a problem to be solved. Imagine living centuries with honor, ceremony, and authority, and then being told by a man in itchy wool that you were an abomination. That's colonialism in a nutshell. Barging in, misreading everything, and then setting fire to it. Spanish chroniclers wrote about two spirits in the 1500s, with the fascination of people cataloguing animals at a zoo. They described clothing, mannerisms, unions, but missed the point entirely. You weren't spectacle, you were structured. The Navajo Nedli, the Lakota winked, the Zuni Lamana each had clearly defined roles, but Europeans squinted, saw what didn't fit their categories, and declared it unnatural. And then came the punishment. Missions tried to erase your role by force. Beatings, conversions, executions. Some accounts describe two-spirit, people being targeted precisely because their existence embodied the worldview colonizers wanted to crush. Destroy the mediators, the balance keepers, and you destabilize the community from within. It was social sabotage disguised as salvation. The United States and Canada later took the project further. Boarding schools, set up in the 19th and 20th centuries, ripped children from their families, cut their hair, forbade their languages, and hammered Christian gender norms into them. Two-spirit children were shamed, punished, and sometimes erased before they even reached adulthood. What had once been a position of honor became something spoken of only in whispers, if at all. And the irony is brutal. Colonizers condemned you for crossing gender roles, while simultaneously imposing their own alien order on entire nations. They preached about sin while looting land. They called you deviant while drafting treaties with one hand and breaking them with the other. If hypocrisy had a patron saint, it wore a colonial collar. Suppression wasn't just spiritual, it was physical. Violence against two-spirit people was documented. Ceremonies that once featured you were outlawed under federal bans. Your sacred duties became criminal offenses. The places where you once sang, danced, or meditated became battlegrounds for survival. Communities were forced into silence. Parents who once proudly announced a child's two-spirit path now hid it, afraid of punishment. What had been identity became secret. What had been celebrated became shame. Not because the culture changed on its own, but because colonial violence demanded it. And yet, even under this weight, memory persisted. Stories kept flickering, sometimes buried deep, sometimes disguised, but not extinguished. Grandmothers still whispered, families still noticed. Some knowledge hid underground, waiting for the moment it could breathe again. The eerie part of colonial suppression is how thoroughly it tried to unmake you, not just the person, but the category itself. Erase the role, erase the stories, erase the words. Pretend the complexity never existed. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. Even in the most violent centuries, fragments of recognition survived, tucked into songs, ceremonies, and the stubborn persistence of identity. And survival underground has its own story. The hidden generations, the coded respect, the way people carried what they weren't allowed to name. Silence became the new ceremony. After centuries where your role was sung about in open circles, colonial law and missionary fire forced it underground. Families who once celebrated a two-spirit child now lowered their voices, glancing over shoulders before admitting what they saw. Recognition didn't vanish, it went quiet, like embers smothered but still burning under ash. In boarding schools, children learned quickly that the smallest expression of difference could mean punishment. So identities that once carried honor had to be hidden behind masks of obedience. You learned to nod, to pray in foreign words, to dress in uniforms that stripped away everything ceremonial. And still, somewhere in the bones of those children, the old recognition stirred. A gesture, a story, a secret nickname passed in whispers, codes of survival. Communities developed their own strategies of concealment. In some places, elders protected knowledge by passing it only to those they trusted, wrapping it in metaphors or stories that colonizers couldn't decode. In others, the role survived in fragments, a half-remembered song, a family tradition of adoption, an auntie whose life didn't quite fit the mold, but was quietly respected nonetheless. The irony is painful. Colonialism tried to paint you as unnatural, yet it took enormous effort to bury what had once been natural for centuries. Governments passed laws, churches burned rituals, schools terrorized children, all to crush identities that had functioned perfectly well long before Europeans forgot how to share a continent. If anything was unnatural, it was the campaign of erasure itself. And yet, survival persisted. Oral traditions carried subtle references. Anthropologists, often clumsy, sometimes exploitative, still recorded glimpses of two-spirit roles in the 19th and early 20th centuries. proof that the category hadn't disappeared, only retreated from the colonizer's gaze. Even in silence, memory resisted. For individuals, survival often meant a kind of double life. Publicly, you performed the expected roles: husband, wife, student, worker. Privately, you carried an identity you might only share with a trusted few. It was a return to secrecy, but secrecy with teeth. Each choice to survive became defiance, even when it looked like compliance. Communities themselves carried a quiet ache. Elders who remembered openly honoring two-spirit relatives saw those roles wither, replaced by shame imported from outside. But memory doesn't obey law. The knowledge that once, long ago, two spirits were healers, mediators, storytellers, and spouses never fully disappeared. It lingered like a shadow behind every sermon, every regulation, every beating. And here's where the eerie humor creeps in. Colonial authorities believed they had succeeded. They believed they had stamped out the role. But if you look closely, you see the opposite. The very violence of erasure only proves how powerful the role was. Nobody burns what isn't threatening. Nobody legislates against something unless it carries weight. In trying so hard to destroy you, colonialism testified to your importance. That's what survival underground really means. It wasn't a defeat, it was an incubation. It was memory folding itself tight, waiting for a time when it could unfurl again. And eventually, it did. In the late 20th century, as indigenous communities gathered strength, voices rose to name what had been buried, to reclaim the identity that colonizers had tried to erase. From silence, revival began. The silence didn't last forever. By the late 20th century, indigenous communities began pulling buried memories back into daylight. The word that emerged, two-spirit, was chosen in 1990 at a gathering in Winnipeg, a way to name something colonial languages had flattened or mocked. It wasn't a new identity, but a modern banner for a set of roles that had always existed, a phrase woven from both tradition and survival. Now, picture the scene: conferences, powwows, gatherings where people introduce themselves as two-spirit without lowering their voices. Songs that once risked punishment are sung publicly. Ceremonies that were outlawed find their rhythm again. The role that had been forced underground is reasserted as not only valid, but vital. Two-spirit organizations form across Turtle Island. They host pride marches, cultural festivals, and healing circles. They remind both native and non-native audiences that gender diversity isn't a trend borrowed from modern discourse. It's an old truth, older than the nations that tried to erase it. And in those spaces, people rediscover that being two-spirit is not just about who you love or how you dress. It's about balance, mediation, healing, storytelling, kinship, responsibility, the same foundations that once shaped entire communities. Of course, revitalization isn't simple. Colonization left scars. Churches, schools, and governments trained generations to see shame where there was once respect. Some native communities still wrestle with that legacy, carrying the tension between old traditions and imported moral codes. For many two-spirit people today, affirmation exists alongside discrimination, honor alongside hostility. Revitalization is work, not a miracle. And yet, it continues. At powwows, two-spirit drums beat again. In councils, two-spirit voices take the mic. Youth, who once thought they were alone, find words, elders, and history telling them otherwise. In urban centers and reservations alike, gatherings celebrate the return of what was never truly gone. The irony: colonizers tried to erase you by calling you unnatural, only for your revival to demonstrate that your existence is as old as the land itself. What's newer, stranger, and more fragile is the imported binary they insisted on. Your revival isn't invention, it's correction. It's a reminder that complexity was always the baseline, that communities functioned better when they recognized the value of balance. And there's something quietly eerie about how the role persists. Across centuries of suppression, the threads never fully snapped. They frayed, tangled, hid, but they didn't break. When people today call themselves two-spirit, they're not inventing an identity. They're pulling on a rope that stretches back through generations, through ceremonies whispered, through stories half forgotten, through ancestors who refused to let erasure win. So here you stand, part of a revival that isn't about nostalgia, but about survival and future. You aren't simply looking back at what two-spirit once meant. You're actively reshaping it, weaving tradition with modernity. carrying forward a role that still matters in healing, balance, and cultural renewal. And the lesson buried in all of this: you can suppress, outlaw, and punish, but you can't erase what's woven into the architecture of human survival. The role of the two-spirit, gender, spirit, and survival braided together remains, not a curiosity, not a relic, a living thread pulled tight through history, now visible again. In many indigenous nations, childhood wasn't a private experiment in personality. It was a public text read by everyone around the fire. A child's gestures, dreams, or preferences were never dismissed as quirks. They were scanned for clues, omens, signs of what the spirits had already written into the body. And when a child wandered outside the neat division of boy tasks and girl tasks, people didn't panic. They paid attention. The earliest recognition of what would later be called two-spirit identity often began with the smallest details. A boy who preferred tools for sewing hides instead of the bow. A girl who reached for the bowstring with unmistakable ease. Sometimes it was a dream, vivid, insistent, that a grandmother insisted carried meaning. Sometimes it was the way a child moved through ceremonies, stepping into spaces where others hesitated. These moments weren't catalogued as accidents. They were read as evidence. Families leaned heavily on elders for interpretation. The old women with hair like braided smoke. The medicine men who swore to their ancestors still whispered to them. They were the ones who spotted a child lingering too long at the fire, staring as if translating something only they could see. Marked, they might mutter, not as an insult but as a diagnosis. To be marked meant a destiny had already chosen its host. The signs weren't always subtle. Oral histories speak of children who, from an early age, displayed knowledge they weren't supposed to have. The names of plants, the rules of rituals, or even predictions of weather shifts that baffled adults until proven true. A strange fluency in things beyond one's years was a red flag, but in the best way possible. It was the kind of red flag communities wanted to keep around, because survival had little patience for coincidence. Recognition often came with ceremony. Among some nations, once a child's difference becomes undeniable, a small ritual might be held, not to shame, but to acknowledge. It marked the child as someone whose path diverged from the ordinary. The community wasn't blind to how unusual that was, but unusual, in this context, translated into sacred colonial chroniclers, arriving centuries later, often misread this entirely. They scribbled notes about strange boys in women's dress or girls refusing their natural duties, as if what they were watching was rebellion. They missed that these communities already had categories in place, roles prepared, and expectations ready. A child stepping across boundaries wasn't breaking the rules, they were fulfilling ones. The eerie beauty of this system was how flexible and yet how binding it could be. Once recognized, the child's path narrowed into a role larger than themselves. Freedom was real, but it was freedom shaped by destiny. You didn't just get to choose hobbies. You inherited responsibilities to the spiritual architecture of your people, and with recognition came training. Families didn't shrug and hope the child figured it out alone. They sought mentors, people already walking the same path, or elders who could begin passing down stories, rituals, and medicine. What started with a grandmother's whisper soon became a roadmap, one that led straight into the demanding, sacred work of healing. The recognition of difference in childhood was only the opening act. What followed was a lesson drilled into every ceremony, every story, every hunt that returned with meat, and every one that didn't. The world only worked when balance was held. Crops, weather, kinship, the breath in one's lungs, all of it was sustained by balance. And imbalance was the doorway to illness, famine, or chaos. This wasn't a metaphor. It was the operating system of existence. Into this framework, two-spirit individuals fit with uncanny precision. Their very bodies were interpreted as living examples of equilibrium, carrying both masculine and feminine qualities without collapsing into one or the other. Where others embodied a single pole, they embodied the bridge. And in communities that measured health not as the absence of disease, but as harmony across body, spirit, and land, that bridge became indispensable. Healing wasn't a technical task. It was a realignment. A fever wasn't simply bacteria. It was imbalance, a signal that the body and the spirit had fallen out of step. A quarrel wasn't only bad temper. It was the beginning of social disorder that could ripple outward until fields refused to yield. When two spirits stepped into the role of healer, their dual identity was understood as a natural qualification. They weren't outsiders dabbling in medicine. They were balance personified, a living antidote to imbalance itself. Herbs, chants, and rituals were tools, yes, but the practitioner mattered as much as the instruments. A person embodying both sides of gender carried a kind of legitimacy that others did not. Their presence alone in the healing space tilted the scales toward restoration. The patient wasn't simply being treated with plants or smoke. They were being drawn back into the pattern of harmony by someone who existed in between. This duality was often ritualized. In some ceremonies, two spirit healers wore garments that mixed gendered elements, not as costumes but as reminders of their role. Their songs carried tones said to echo both masculine and feminine voices. Even the tools they used might cross categories. A rattle associated with warriors, combined with herbs usually tended by women. Each detail reinforced the same principle. Balance was the cure, and they were its vessel. Of course, this wasn't romantic leisure. Carrying balance also meant carrying expectation. If a healing failed, if a ritual misfired, suspicion could fall heavily. The same duality that made one sacred also made one vulnerable. Communities leaned on their two-spirit healers, not only in times of illness but in moments of collective fear, drought, famine, epidemics. Successes earned reverence. Failures were read as dangerous cracks in the cosmic order. Colonial observers once again misunderstood this. They interpreted the reverence for two-spirit healers as superstition, dismissing chants and herbs as primitive medicine. They missed that healing here wasn't isolated from community, land, or spirit. It was all of those together, and two spirits stood at the center, embodying a balance that textbooks and microscopes could never measure. It was this deep link between identity and equilibrium that prepared the way for training. If one's body already mirrored balance, then one's life would be shaped into service of it. Knowledge of plants, ceremonies, and the delicate art of realignment would have to be learned, preserved, and performed, and no one was left to stumble into that alone. Balance alone didn't make a healer. Recognition marked the beginning, but training was the long road that followed. Knowledge of plants, rituals, and spiritual protocol wasn't open source. It was guarded, passed carefully from those who held it to those chosen to carry it forward. And when a two-spirit child was marked for this role, elders took notice, sometimes shifting the trajectory of their education entirely. Instruction rarely resembled a classroom. There were no chalkboards, no lectures. Lessons came from long walks in the forest, kneeling in the dirt, while an elder pointed out plants whose names carried as much history as chemistry. A stalk wasn't just a stalk, it was a remedy for coughs, a protection against spirits, or a warning to avoid unless properly prepared. Memorization wasn't optional. A mistake could sicken rather than heal. Apprenticeship meant absorbing entire ecosystems until the land itself became a library. The training wasn't limited to plants. Rituals required choreography, language, and memory. Chants carried syllables so old they had no translation, only power. A misplaced breath could be read as disrespect to the spirits invoked. So, young apprentices learned not just words but the silences between them, the pauses where meaning gathered weight. Transmission also meant storytelling. Elders rarely said, "This is how you heal a fever." They told stories about a hunter who nearly died in winter, saved only by a root dug beneath the snow. They recounted dreams where ancestors revealed combinations of herbs. Knowledge arrived disguised as narrative, and the sharpest apprentices learned to peel the medicine from the myth. For two-spirit apprentices, training carried a second layer, the blending of gendered knowledge, where boys might be taught hunting medicines and women instructed in birthing remedies. Two spirits often received both. They learned the plants that kept warriors steady and the herbs that eased childbirth. They were given access across categories, trusted to hold knowledge usually split between sexes. And this crossing wasn't seen as theft, it was destiny. Their bodies carried duality. so their minds were expected to carry it too. This dual access made them repositories of rare depth, but also targets of expectation. Once marked and trained, they couldn't simply step away. Communities invested in their education, and in return, they were expected to serve. A life of freedom narrowed into a life of obligation. Sacred knowledge was a gift, but a heavy one. Colonial disruption threatened this transmission most directly. Missionaries and government agents outlawed ceremonies, uprooted communities, and declared traditional healing illegal. Apprenticeships broke, elders silenced, knowledge scattered, but fragments endured. Some were hidden in stories told under blankets, others carried by elders who refused to let the chain break completely. And in those fragments, the training of two-spirit healers limped forward, waiting for a safer time to emerge again. Yet in the centuries before suppression, this training carved out entire identities. It wasn't just an education. It was a transformation, shaping people into vessels who could not only handle knowledge, but perform it in ways that restored balance. And once trained, their hands, voices, and presence became tools of healing, tools that were tested constantly in rituals where the stakes were nothing less than life, death, and harmony itself. Training eventually led to performance, and performance in this case meant ritual. Healing wasn't a quiet matter of swallowing herbs and hoping for the best. It was theater, ceremony, and spiritual negotiation, staged with the precision of someone convinced that the universe was watching because everyone believed it was. A sick body was rarely seen as an isolated problem. Illness belonged to a network, the family, the land, the spirits, the ancestors. To heal one person meant to rebalance the web around them. Two-spirit healers entered that web with the authority of people who embodied harmony in their very being. Their dual identity was read as proof that they could coax order out of chaos, and so the task fell to them. Rituals varied, but certain elements appeared again and again. Smoke played a starring role. Herbs burned not only for their scent, but for their ability to carry prayers upward, to scrub away what clung invisibly to the body. Chants followed, low and repetitive, syllables older than any listener, vibrating through bone and sinew. Sometimes rattles joined in. Their rhythm meant to scatter the sickness like frightened birds. Sacred objects were handled with reverence. Bundles wrapped in hide, feathers, stones polished by generations. These weren't symbolic props. They were tools thought to house power. A healer might pass a bundle over the body, draw it through the air, or set it beside the patient's head. Each gesture part of a choreography rehearsed through years of apprenticeship. The wrong movement could signal insult to the spirits. Precision mattered as much as intention. Plants anchored the rituals. Poultices spread across skin. Teas brewed in careful sequence. Roots chewed to release hidden strength. But plants were never just plants. They were allies. Each carried personality, preference, a history of interaction with the people who used them. To misuse them was not only bad medicine, it was a bad relationship. Two-spirit healers often carried extensive knowledge of which plant belonged in which ritual, and when timing was everything. Dawn roots, midday leaves, twilight bark. The eerie quality of these rituals was their intimacy. A healer leaned close, chanting into a patient's ear. Hands pressed gently over wounds. Breath carried prayers directly to the body. Illness was engaged as if it could hear, because it was believed to XLPIs, already marked as people who moved between categories, were thought to communicate more effectively with these unseen presences. Communities measured the success of these rituals, not only in physical recovery, but in signs of restored harmony. A patient who sat up laughing, a sudden break in fever, a dream of ancestors smiling, all counted as proof. But the weight of failure hung just as heavily. If the ritual didn't work, questions surfaced. Was the sickness too strong? Had the spirits been offended? Was the healer out of balance themselves? The line between revered and blamed was perilously thin. Colonial records predictably mocked this. Missionaries dismissed chants as noise, smoke as superstition, bundles as fetish. They catalogued rituals with detached disdain, failing to see that what looked to them like primitive performance was, for the community, a technology of survival. Healing wasn't a hobby or spectacle. It was survival staged with precision, carried out by those who embodied the balance everyone else depended on. And nowhere did that responsibility weigh heavier than at the edge of life, when breath faltered and death pressed close, because a healer's work didn't end with illness. It followed people into their final crossing. Training eventually led to performance, and performance in this case meant ritual. Healing wasn't a quiet matter of swallowing herbs and hoping for the best. It was theater, ceremony, and spiritual negotiation, staged with the precision of someone convinced that the universe was watching, because everyone believed it was. A sick body was rarely seen as an isolated problem. Illness belonged to a network, the family, the land, the spirits, the ancestors. To heal one person meant to rebalance the web around them. Two spirit healers entered that web with the authority of people who embodied harmony in their very being. Their dual identity was read as proof that they could coax order out of chaos, and so the task fell to them. Rituals varied, but certain elements appeared again and again. Smoke played a starring role. Herbs burned not only for their scent, but for their ability to carry prayers upward, to scrub away what clung invisibly to the body. Chants followed, low and repetitive, syllables older than any listener, vibrating through bone and sinew. Sometimes rattles joined in. Their rhythm meant to scatter the sickness like frightened birds. Sacred objects were handled with reverence. Bundles wrapped in hide, feathers, stones polished by generations. These weren't symbolic props. They were tools thought to house power. A healer might pass a bundle over the body, draw it through the air, or set it beside the patient's head. Each gesture part of a choreography rehearsed through years of apprenticeship. The wrong movement could signal insult to the spirits. Precision mattered as much as intention. Plants anchored the rituals. Poultices spread across skin. Teas brewed in careful sequence. Roots chewed to release hidden strength. But plants were never just plants. They were allies. Each carried personality, preference, a history of interaction with the people who used them. To misuse them was not only bad medicine, it was bad relationship. Two spirit healers often carried extensive knowledge of which plant belonged in which ritual, and when timing was everything. Dawn roots, midday leaves, twilight bark. The eerie quality of these rituals was their intimacy. A healer leaned close, chanting into a patient's ear. Hands pressed gently over wounds. Breath carried prayers directly to the body. Illmith was engaged with as if he could hear, because it was believed that two spirits, already marked as people who moved between categories, were thought to communicate more effectively with these unseen presences. Communities measured the success of these rituals not only in physical recovery, but in signs of restored harmony. A patient who sat up laughing, a sudden break in fever, a dream of ancestors smiling, all counted as proof, but the weight of failure hung just as heavily. If the ritual didn't work, questions surfaced. Was the sickness too strong? Had the spirits been offended? Was the healer out of balance themselves? The line between revered and blamed was perilously thin. Colonial records predictably mocked this. Missionaries dismissed chants as noise, smoke as superstition, bundles as fetish. They catalogued rituals with detached disdain, failing to see that what looked to them like primitive performance was, for the community, a technology of survival. Healing wasn't a hobby or spectacle. It was survival staged with precision, carried out by those who embodied the balance everyone else depended on. And nowhere did that responsibility weigh heavier than at the edge of life, when breath faltered and death pressed close. Because a healer's work didn't end with illness. It followed people into their final crossing. If sickness was a dialogue with imbalance, death was the moment that dialogue snapped. And when that happened, two spirit healers often stepped forward, not as mourners on the edges, but as guides at the very center of the crossing. Death wasn't silence, it was a transition, and transitions required specialists. Preparing the body was both practical and sacred. Skins had to be cleaned, painted, or wrapped, objects placed carefully for the journey ahead. But each act was a negotiation, with the spirit of the deceased, with the family, and with whatever forces waited beyond the horizon. Two spirit hands often performed this work, steady not only because of training, but because their identity itself was seen as a bridge. If they could embody balance in life, surely they could help shepherd balance in death. Songs accompanied the process, low chants designed to carry the spirit along. Some traditions describe the journey after death as a trail, one littered with obstacles or guardians. The songs weren't entertainment, they were maps, each syllable a step, each rhythm a guide. To falter in song was to risk losing the dead in unfamiliar terrain. Communities placed that responsibility in the mouths of those they trusted most, and two spirits often carried the tune. Objects placed with the body held equal weight. A bow, a tool, food, or clothing might be included, all arranged to ease the transition. But symbolic items also appeared: feathers, stones, charms prepared in advance. Handling these wasn't a casual task. It was performed by those who thought they knew how to speak across the line, dividing the living from the dead. Again, the role fell naturally to the ones who lived in between categories themselves. Funerary rites extended beyond the body. Families looked for omens, animals appearing near the lodge, unusual weather, dreams in the days following death. Two spirit figures were often asked to interpret these, to explain whether the spirit had crossed safely or lingered unhappily nearby. Their words carried weight, not because they claimed authority, but because the community believed the spirits spoke more clearly through them. The eerie humor here is that the living sometimes feared them as much as they respected them. A two-spirit healer who had guided dozens of souls was seen as carrying a kind of residue, touched by death more than most. Families might keep respectful distance, even while begging for their insight. Reverence, in this context, meant both honor and caution. Colonial observers, of course, flattened all this into caricature. They described strange rituals of death, dismissing songs as meaningless and bundles as superstition. They failed to see that these practices weren't peripheral but central, binding the living community together in grief while guiding the dead into whatever lay beyond. For the people themselves, two spirits weren't curiosities at funerals, they were indispensable. Death, in this framework, wasn't an end but a continuation, and those who carried two spirits were considered uniquely equipped to manage continuations, to keep the flow moving from one state into another. It was never simply about healing the sick. It was about ensuring that when healing failed, the crossing wasn't botched, the spirit wasn't stranded, and the community didn't collapse under fear of imbalance. But handling the dead only deepened the association of two spirits with mediation, not just between life and death, but between entire worlds. And from there, their role expanded into something broader, the recognized bridge between human beings and the unseen. The living wanted answers, and spirits were notoriously cryptic. They spoke in dreams, in animal appearances, in sudden weather changes that ruined everyone's plans. Translating those signals into something useful required specialists, and two spirits often carried that burden. Having already blurred the lines of gender, they were thought to blur the lines of worlds as well. Visions played a central role. A dream of an eagle circling 3 times wasn't shrugged off as coincidence. It demanded interpretation, and people often turned to the one who, by definition, walked in between. A two-spirit mediator could transform strange imagery into guidance, a warning of famine, a blessing for a marriage, or instructions for a new ritual. Whether or not the spirits actually meant those things, the authority of the interpretation held weight. Communities trusted it because they trusted the body. It came from a body seen as carrying dual voices. Ritual trance deepened the connection. Through drumming, chanting, or smoke, mediators entered altered states, believed to communicate directly with spirits. What they reported upon return was taken seriously. Ancestors demanding offerings, animals revealing safe hunting grounds, warnings of conflicts brewing. To modern ears, it sounds like dream analysis with higher stakes. To their communities, it was survival intelligence. Sometimes the mediation wasn't dramatic. A child had a nightmare, a hunter stumbled over omens, a family feared they had offended the dead. Two-spirit healers stepped in quietly, offering explanations, performing small rites, restoring calm. They didn't only manage cosmic crises, they managed daily anxiety, the low-level fear of living in a world where every gust of wind could be a message. The humor sits in the constant expectation. Spirits apparently refused to mind their own business. Every odd sound in the night, every animal behaving strangely, every dream with too much detail landed on the two spirits' doorstep. Imagine being held accountable for weather patterns or owl behavior. Sacred authority came with a to-do list that never ended. This role also gave two spirits a degree of political influence. In councils, their interpretations of omens could sway decisions, whether to move camp, when to raid, which alliances to pursue. Their voices weren't separate from leadership, they shaped it. That authority wasn't arbitrary. It was built on the belief that someone living beyond ordinary categories could see beyond ordinary sight. Colonizers, predictably, found this terrifying. The idea that a person outside rigid gender norms could hold religious and political authority clashed violently with European systems. Missionaries wrote furiously about sorcery and unnatural shamans, often targeting two-spirits precisely because their influence extended beyond ritual into governance. Destroy the mediators, and you severed the community's line to the unseen. But suppression didn't erase the memory of mediation. Even when ceremonies were outlawed, even when public trance was mocked or punished, fragments persisted. Dreams still needed interpreting. Families still whispered of signs. And the role of bridge, though forced underground, never completely disappeared. The thread tying all of this together was respect. To be trusted as a mediator meant being honored as someone the community couldn't function without. That respect carried into other areas of life, shaping social standing, influence, and daily interactions in ways outsiders rarely understood. Authority didn't always wear a crown or carry a club. Sometimes it wore beadwork, carried herbs, and spoke in the measured tone of someone who'd just returned from conversing with ancestors. Two-spirit healers gained respect, not through inheritance or conquest, but through function. They did things nobody else could safely do, and in small-scale societies, indispensability translated directly into power. Communities demonstrated this respect in visible ways. A two-spirit figure might be given a prominent place at feasts. Their words sought at councils, their blessings requested before hunts or battles. A warrior sharpening his arrows might pause to receive a nod of approval. A mother in labor might insist on their presence to ensure safe delivery. These gestures weren't minor. They placed the two-spirit role alongside chiefs, shamans, and elders as one of the recognized pillars of order. Respect also showed up in material terms. Some communities offered gifts, hides, food, crafted items, in exchange for healing or mediation. Payment wasn't framed as commerce. It was reciprocity, acknowledgement that sacred labor demanded support. And while most people could trade their skills for survival, two-spirits often received offerings that doubled as public recognition of their unique authority. This status extended beyond economics. Partners of two-spirit individuals were sometimes regarded as fortunate, admired for aligning themselves with someone blessed by duality. Far from being marginalized, such unions could elevate social standing. The colonial idea of scandal was a foreign import. In many indigenous contexts, the relationship itself carried prestige. Authority carried burdens as well. Reverence created distance. To be respected was also to be watched. Every action became symbolic, every word interpreted as omen. A two-spirit healer couldn't simply joke idly at a gathering. A casual remark might be repeated as prophecy. Respect in this context was inseparable from surveillance. And while status protected against certain dangers, it also sharpened expectations. Failure in healing could be devastating, not only for the patient, but for the healer's reputation. Communities revered their two-spirit figures, but reverence didn't mean unconditional forgiveness. Authority was conditional, renewed with every successful ritual, every restored balance. The irony here is how differently colonial chroniclers framed it. They saw two-spirits as curiosities on the fringe, when in reality they often stood close to the center of social life. Their voices weren't decorative, they shaped decisions, interpreted crises, and stabilized kinship ties. To remove them was to weaken the entire system, a fact colonial powers exploited when they targeted two-spirits for erasure. And yet, within their own societies, their authority wasn't contested in the way European rulers constantly fended off rivals. It was embedded in the belief that duality itself was sacred. Authority didn't have to be justified with armies or wealth. It was embodied, visible, undeniable. People might whisper, question, even fear, but they still deferred. This respect, however, wasn't just about leadership in councils or ceremonies. It was woven into how gender itself was understood, how legitimacy as a healer or shaman depended on the recognition of that embodied duality. Authority was not only political or social, it was spiritual, rooted in the sacred logic of gender and balance. Authority alone didn't explain why two-spirit healers were trusted with such delicate work. Their legitimacy came from something deeper, the way their bodies and identities were read as sacred proof of balance. Gender wasn't simply biology in these societies, it was cosmology. To cross its boundaries was not to break the order, but to embody it in a way most people never could. Communities recognized masculine and feminine roles, not as rigid boxes but as complementary forces, each with their duties, powers, and responsibilities. To embody both was to be more than human in some sense, to carry a doubled access. Two spirits could weave, heal, and sing as women did, while also participating in hunting, ritual, or warfare as men did. This overlap wasn't a contradiction. It was seen as harmony, as if the individual body itself had been designed as a bridge. In healing, this legitimacy mattered profoundly. Women might traditionally manage childbirth remedies, while men prepare hunting medicines. Two spirits often knew both, trusted to handle the full spectrum of life, from birth to battle. Their gender identity wasn't incidental to this role, it was the credential that made it possible. Without that embodied duality, they wouldn't have been seen as authorized to cross into those realms. Ceremonial garments often reflected this. A healer might wear clothing that combined elements coded male and female, not as costume but as theology stitched into fabric. A belt associated with warriors paired with a skirt decorated with quills, or beadwork mixing symbols from both gendered domains. Their appearance wasn't eccentric. It was visual confirmation of legitimacy, reminding everyone present that this person carried duality openly, without shame. Colonial accounts were baffled by this. European writers, steeped in rigid binaries, saw contradiction where indigenous communities saw completion. They described two spirits with a mixture of fascination and disdain, failing to grasp that their gendered difference wasn't tolerated in spite of spiritual roles, but precisely because of them. In native cosmologies, legitimacy as a healer wasn't compromised by duality, it was guaranteed by it. This legitimacy extended to their perceived access to spirits. The unseen world itself was often imagined in terms of dual forces, life and death, male and female, light and dark. A person who embodied two poles at once was thought to navigate that realm with unusual fluency. Dreams, visions, and rituals carried more weight when performed by someone already marked as in between. The logic was simple. If the healer's very existence defied ordinary categories, why wouldn't their spirit do the same? The irony is that what outsiders saw as weakness was precisely what their own people saw as strength. European systems treated gender nonconformity as deviance. Indigenous systems treated it as sacred capacity. Legitimacy was read directly into the body, and the body became credential enough. Yet this sacred legitimacy also made two spirits visible targets when colonial powers began dismantling indigenous systems. To strip them of authority, missionaries attacked not just the rituals they performed, but the gendered foundation of their legitimacy. The goal was not only to outlaw ceremonies, but to collapse the worldview that made those ceremonies possible. Still, before that rupture, the intertwining of gender and spirituality had already secured the place of two spirits for centuries. Their legitimacy was not fragile or marginal, it was central, and it was precisely this centrality that made them dangerous in the eyes of colonizers, who soon sought to erase them altogether. When missionaries and officials finally arrived, they didn't come with curiosity. They came with categories, and those categories had no room for someone who healed bodies and guided spirits while wearing garments stitched from both sides of the gender divide. What indigenous nations regarded as sacred, colonizers branded as dangerous. The first accounts from Spanish and later French and English chroniclers are almost predictable in their condescension. They wrote about strange men in women's dress, reducing complex roles to costumes. They sneered at ceremonies, calling them sorcery, and claimed healers were tricksters preying on gullible villagers. What they failed to see, or refused to admit, was that these so-called curiosities were people standing at the very heart of social survival. Suppression didn't stop at ridicule. Laws outlawed ceremonies outright. In the United States, the late 19th century bans on traditional dances and rituals effectively criminalized the work of two-spirit healers. In Canada, the Indian Act and residential schools enforced similar erasures. Healing bundles were confiscated, sacred songs silenced under threat of punishment. To be caught performing rituals wasn't simply frowned upon, it was a punishable offense. Boarding schools struck at the roots. Children marked as different, the very ones once recognized as carriers of dual spirits, were targeted for correction. Their hair was cut, their languages beaten out of them, their gendered expressions policed into silence. In these institutions, the very signs once celebrated as spiritual gifts were treated as shameful defects. The suppression wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate attempt to erase the categories that made two-spirit healers legitimate. Missionaries were especially invested in this erasure. To them, spiritual authority couldn't be embodied by someone who lived outside their binary framework. Allowing such figures to persist meant allowing alternative theologies to survive, and alternative theologies undermined Christian dominance. Destroying the healer meant destroying the worldview that gave them authority, and so two-spirits became targets, not just as individuals but as institutions. Communities paid dearly for this loss. Healing knowledge fractured. Rituals that had once stabilized families and villages were pushed underground or abandoned. Without sanctioned spaces for their roles, many two-spirits were forced into invisibility, their contributions dismissed or forgotten in public, even as whispers kept fragments alive in private. The suppression wasn't only cultural violence, it was medical violence. People lost access to the healers who had guided them through birth, sickness, and death for generations. The irony, of course, is glaring. Colonizers declared indigenous healing practices superstition, while simultaneously bleeding patients with leeches and prescribing mercury for fevers. They mocked chants and bundles, even as their own doctors relied on treatments that often killed more effectively than the illnesses themselves. Civilization, in this context, looked suspiciously like organized ignorance. Yet even at the height of suppression, traces endured. Some elders continued to teach in secret, passing stories and fragments of ritual knowledge to those they trusted. Families whispered about relatives who had once been healers, hiding the memory like contraband. Survival went underground, carried encoded language and discreet gestures. By the time suppression began to loosen in the 20th century, much had been lost, but not everything. Enough fragments remained that, when indigenous communities began reclaiming ceremonies, the memory of two spirits as healers and shamans could be pieced back together. What colonizers had declared extinct turned out to be dormant, and dormancy, unlike extinction, carries the possibility of return, which is exactly what began to unfold as revitalization movements took hold, pulling silenced voices back into ceremony and placing two-spirit healers once again in the circle of survival. For centuries, the role of the two-spirit healer was pushed into the shadows, buried under missionary sermons and school punishments. But shadows aren't voids, they're places where memory waits. And in the late 20th century, those memories began to rise again, not as relics, but as living practices pulled forward into the present. The term two-spirit itself was coined in 1990, at a gathering of indigenous people in Winnipeg, as a way to reclaim identities colonial languages had warped. The phrase gave a banner to what communities had always known, that people embodying gendered duality carried sacred responsibilities. The name was new, the role was not. It was the continuation of a lineage that had never truly ended, only been forced underground. Revitalization took shape in ceremonies first. Dances outlawed for decades re-emerged. Songs once whispered in secret returned to the drum. Two-spirit people began stepping back into ritual spaces, reclaiming the healer's seat beside the fire. Some learned directly from elders who had kept fragments alive. Others pieced knowledge together through oral history, ethnographic records, and collective remembering. The act of returning wasn't smooth. Colonial disruption had left scars, but it was deliberate. Healing itself took on new forms. Two-spirit practitioners today often blend traditional medicine with modern approaches, working in both clinics and ceremonies. They address not only physical sickness, but the traumas of erasure, the violence of residential schools, the epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women and LGBTQ people, the ongoing fractures left by colonization. Their work is as much about cultural restoration as it is about curing fevers. Authority has followed. Two-spirit leaders now organize gatherings, host conferences, and guide community wellness initiatives. They are recognized not only within their own nations but across indigenous movements globally, symbols of resilience and continuity. Where missionaries once declared them aberrations, communities now place them again at the center, as healers, shamans, storytellers, mediators. The irony is sharp. Colonizers tried to annihilate the role, and in doing so, inadvertently testified to its power. If two spirits had been marginal, nobody would have bothered. The sheer energy spent on erasure proves how central they were. Today, their revitalization reads almost like historical revenge. The very people once punished for their existence, now leading movements for cultural survival. But revitalization is not nostalgia. It's not about reenacting some frozen version of the past. It's about living roles in the present, roles that adapt to new crises while holding on to ancient principles. Balance, harmony, duality, these remain, even as the contexts shift. A two-spirit healer in the 21st century might bless a ceremony, advocate for healthcare equity, and host a youth workshop on gender identity, all in the same week. Continuity doesn't mean stagnation, it means survival with teeth. There's something quietly eerie about this endurance. A role that was targeted so systematically, outlawed so aggressively, refused to vanish. It slipped underground, hid in whispers, resurfaced when it could, and now speaks openly again. The thread of healing stretches from the fires of pre-contact villages to conference halls, from chants sung over fevers to speeches delivered at pride marches. And still, at the core, the logic remains unchanged. Duality is sacred, balance is medicine, and survival depends on both. The circle closes here, but not as an ending. Revitalization is less about returning to what was, and more about proving what has always been true. The healer never disappeared, only waited. And now, with voices louder and ceremonies revived, the two-spirit role as healer and shaman stands once again in the open, where it always belonged. For many indigenous nations across North America, gender was never reduced to a box on a census form or a line on a passport. It was a cosmology, a framework for making sense of balance in the world. Masculine and feminine were not enemies locked in eternal combat, but paired forces, each necessary, each incomplete without the other. Just as day required night, rain required soil, and breath required silence, the two genders were seen as complementary halves of a greater order. Within this worldview, individuals who embodied both sides at once weren't anomalies. They were living metaphors for the balance that governed the cosmos. To exist between genders was to embody a principle as old as the stars. Harmony lies in duality. It wasn't about erasing differences, but holding them simultaneously. That was where the sacred edge began to shimmer. Ceremonies often reinforced this logic. Dances invoked both the sun and the moon. Stories paired tricksters with culture heroes, and rituals spoke of creation unfolding through tension and balance. Gender fits into this cosmological structure seamlessly. To hold one role was to participate in one activity. To hold both was to step into the confluence where rivers meet, a place as powerful as it was dangerous. The sacredness of this position was not abstract. It shaped daily life. Those who carried dual identity were seen as embodying balance that others could only strive for. Their existence made visible the invisible principles holding the world together. It was as if harmony had chosen to put on skin and walk among people, reminding everyone else that categories were not prisons, but points on a spectrum of relations. But sacredness rarely comes without risk. The same cosmology that elevated them also made them vulnerable. Because if balance failed, if crops withered or illness spread, suspicion could circle back. The person who symbolized harmony could just as easily be accused of disrupting it. Reverence and danger shared the same bed. What made this cosmology so different from European frameworks was its refusal to collapse difference into hierarchy. Masculine did not trump, nor feminine masculine. Instead, both were necessary to sustain life. And so, when an individual embodied both, they were granted legitimacy as mediators, healers, and spiritual figures. They weren't exceptions to the system. They were its most concentrated expression. Colonial chroniclers were predictably baffled. To them, gender was rigid biology, and either-or with no allowance for overlap. They described dual-gender figures as bizarre curiosities, missing entirely that these individuals fit into a worldview where duality was sacred order. What they dismissed as confusion was, in fact, cosmology in motion. The irony is that living between genders wasn't simply tolerated, It was systemically embedded. It was part of how communities explained survival, balance, and continuity. And because it was cosmology, recognition often began early, when children displayed signs that seemed to echo both sides of the spectrum. Families noticed, the elders interpreted, and from that moment on, sacred and dangerous threads began to entwine around a life not yet fully grown. Signs rarely went unnoticed. In villages where survival hinged on reading weather from the clouds or omens from bird flight, people were equally skilled at reading children. The smallest gestures were scrutinized: the boy who preferred quills and dyes over bows, the girl who instinctively joined men in preparing a hunt, the child whose dreams contained images of ancestors no one had spoken aloud. These weren't dismissed as quirks, they were interpreted as signals. Grandmothers, especially, were the keepers of such recognition, with eyes that had outlasted wars, famines, and for generations of mischief. They noticed when a child lingered in spaces where others did not. They muttered phrases like marked or touched, words that didn't suggest shame but destiny. Families took those mutterings seriously. A child's path could shift in a single evening, redirected not by choice but by interpretation. Dreams carried particular weight. A child who described being visited by animals, or who insisted on knowing ceremonial songs without ever being taught, was treated with caution. Elders leaned in, tested them with questions, gauged whether the voice of the unseen had already claimed them. Recognition wasn't simply about gender expression. It was about signs that this child was being recruited by forces larger than themselves. Some communities ritualized the acknowledgement. A small feast might be held, relatives presenting the child with objects from both sides of the gender divide: a bow and a basket, a spear and a spindle, to mark the dual path ahead. The child wasn't mocked for choosing differently. They were affirmed as someone destined to walk a road most could never imagine. Sacredness was declared before they even understood what it meant. Of course, with sacred recognition came danger. To be singled out so young meant expectations grew heavy quickly. Other children could stumble through their roles, learn slowly, fail often. A child marked as living between genders had less room for error. Each misstep risked being read as imbalance, a dangerous omen rather than ordinary clumsiness. Reverence and scrutiny arrived hand in hand. The irony was that colonial observers, scribbling in their journals, described these moments with a mix of bewilderment and disgust. They wrote of boys raised as girls or girls trained as men, flattening complex ceremonies into crude categories. What they missed entirely was that recognition in childhood wasn't punishment, it was an investment. Communities weren't correcting mistakes, they were affirming roles. And the affirmation wasn't sentimental, it was pragmatic. Survival required healers, mediators, interpreters of dreams. If a child showed signs of possessing those gifts, the community made sure they were guided, trained, and woven into the web of responsibility. Childhood was never simply childhood in this sense. It was an apprenticeship in cosmology. This sacred recognition set the stage for what followed. A child so marked didn't grow into freedom. They grew into obligation. Their lives became paths of training and transmission, absorbing knowledge across boundaries others never crossed. And from those years of preparation came the role that both elevated them and placed them in constant danger, carriers of dual knowledge. Once a child was marked, the education shifted. Ordinary boys learned the plants that gave hunters stamina, the chants whispered before war, the medicines used to bind wounds after battle. Ordinary girls learned the roots that eased childbirth, the ways of tanning hides, the songs that calmed infants and guarded crops. But for those living between genders, both doors opened. They weren't ushered into one sphere. They were handed the keys to both. Dual access meant long days and longer expectations. Apprenticeship with women gave lessons in weaving, beadwork, gathering herbs, and understanding the delicate rhythms of the body. Apprenticeship with men brought hunting rituals, knowledge of weapons, and the politics of councils. Crossing those boundaries wasn't seen as trespass. It was an obligation. If a person embodied duality, they were expected to carry dual knowledge. This access was both a blessing and a trap. On one hand, it gave a breadth of understanding that few could rival. A two-spirit healer might know how to bless a bowstring for accuracy and how to prepare an infusion for easing childbirth. They became repositories of skills stretching across the gendered divide, embodying balance not only in identity but in practice. On the other hand, there was no option of slipping into ordinary anonymity. Every talent learned tightened the knot of responsibility. Knowledge wasn't abstract, it was lived. Learning plants meant kneeling in the dirt, memorizing which root must be dug before dawn, which leaf lost potency if harvested after rain. Learning chants meant repetition until syllables older than memory became second nature. These were not hobbies. A wrong plant could kill. A missed word could insult spirits. Mistakes carried consequences beyond embarrassment. Ceremonial training reinforced the dual path. Two spirits often prepared sacred objects, combining tools from both masculine and feminine spheres. A rattle associated with warriors might be bound in cloth stitched by women. A garment used in ceremony could carry patterns coded from both roles. Each object embodied the same principle the person embodied: unity of opposites, held together without collapse. But with greater knowledge came greater suspicion. The breadth of skills sometimes drew whispers. Power concentrated in one body always unsettles people. Admiration could turn quickly to unease, especially if crops failed or a ritual faltered. The one who knew too much might be blamed for disturbing balance instead of restoring it. Sacredness and danger walked hand in hand. Again, colonial witnesses misread this entirely. They described it as confusion, men taking on women's work, women acting as men. Their rigid categories couldn't fathom that dual access wasn't a mistake. It was an institution, sustained through generations, valued precisely because it preserved equilibrium. To collapse it into insult was to miss its point entirely. And yet, within the communities themselves, dual access created authority. To hold both kinds of knowledge was to stand at the center of survival, in hunting, in healing, in ceremony. It was also the foundation for the legitimacy of ritual practice, because if a person could carry both genders in their body and both kinds of skills in their mind, who better to carry the authority of sacred performance? The breadth of knowledge wasn't just practical, it was proof. In societies where the sacred and the mundane braided together, authority in ritual came not from titles but from embodiment. To perform a ceremony, to speak for the unseen, one needed legitimacy, and living between genders provided exactly that. Ceremonies were never casual. Smoke rose, chants rippled like threads, objects were arranged with obsessive care. A feather out of place or a syllable mispronounced could be read as an insult to spirits, the kind of insult that might explain why the corn failed or why the deer vanished. To lead in such contexts required more than skill. It required visible authority, the kind written into the body itself. Dual gender identity offered that authority. People believed that someone who embodied both masculine and feminine forces was naturally closer to the balance the ceremony sought to restore. Their presence wasn't ornamental, it was structural. A two-spirit healer standing at the fire was a living reminder that harmony between opposites was possible, that the ritual was grounded in flesh as well as smoke. Clothing reinforced this authority. Ceremonial garments often mixed elements from both gendered spheres, a warrior's belt paired with a quilled skirt, or a headdress combining eagle feathers with beadwork, more often associated with women. To outsiders, it looked like a contradiction. To insiders, it was the uniform of legitimacy, proof that the one leading the ritual was qualified to speak in both registers of existence. Objects, too, were charged with this symbolism. A bundle carried by a two-spirit might hold herbs, bones, and tools coded both masculine and feminine. Each element layered meaning, mirroring the identity of the one who carried it. The bundle wasn't symbolic of balance. It was balanced, condensed, and portable. Ritual legitimacy was more than performance. It had political implications. A blessing offered before a hunt or war could tilt the mood of an entire group. A prophecy delivered in trance could sway decisions at council. Authority in ritual spilled into authority in governance, because the line between sacred and political was often invisible. And since two spirits were seen as carrying legitimacy in ritual, their voices carried weight elsewhere too. But with legitimacy came risk. A failed ritual was never interpreted as a neutral accident. If rain didn't come after a ceremony, if illness lingered despite chance, suspicion turned quickly. The same legitimacy that once granted power could be twisted into accusation. Who else, people might whisper, would the spirits punish so sharply, if not the one who claims to embody balance? The sacred mantle was also a bullseye. Colonial chroniclers wrote about this with both fascination and contempt. They described ceremonies as strange spectacles, focusing on clothing or gestures, while missing the logic beneath. What looked to them like theater was, for the community, survival staged in sacred time, and the two-spirit at the center wasn't a curiosity. They were the guarantor that the ritual wasn't just going through motions, but anchored in legitimacy. This legitimacy fed directly into their social standing, because once a person could stand at the center of ritual, interpret omens, and bless or condemn events, their influence extended well beyond the fire circle. It entered the fabric of daily life, shaping respect, alliances, and even love. Ritual legitimacy never stayed inside the smoke-filled circle. It spilled outward, saturating daily life with authority. A two-spirit healer who blessed crops in the morning might find their opinion quietly shaping council decisions by evening. Respect wasn't only ceremonial, it was practical, social, and sometimes uncomfortably personal. Communities demonstrated respect in visible ways. At feasts, such figures were given honored places, seated near chiefs or elders. Warriors preparing for raids often sought their blessings, believing that an arrow shot with their approval flew straighter. Women in childbirth requested their presence, trusting that hands capable of weaving balance in ceremony could also weave safety into birth. Respect translated into access to spaces, to decisions, to the intimate thresholds of life and death. This respect was often reinforced materially. Families offered gifts, animal hides, food, carefully crafted objects, not as payment, exactly, but as recognition. Healing, prophecy, and mediation required time and energy, and communities acknowledged that by making sure their sacred figures were sustained. Reciprocity was the glue holding respect in place. Influence extended to relationships as well. Partners of two-spirit individuals were not shamed, but often regarded as fortunate. To be chosen by someone marked with sacred balance was itself a kind of blessing, elevating status by association. Where colonizers later imagined scandal, indigenous communities saw prestige. Marriage wasn't rebellion. It was aligned with the sacred, yet reverence carried its own sharp edges. Being respected meant being watched. Every word, every gesture, every glance at a council gathering could be dissected for hidden meaning. A casual remark could morph into prophecy. A furrowed brow might be interpreted as a bad omen. Respect created influence, but it also erased privacy. The community didn't just honor, it scrutinized, and admiration could turn brittle under pressure. When illness persisted or hunts failed, the person most respected became the person most blamed. Authority made them indispensable, but it also made them convenient scapegoats. Respect was real, but it was conditional, renewed with every successful ritual, every moment of balance maintained. Colonial records missed this nuance entirely. Missionaries wrote about two-spirits as marginal curiosities, describing them as tolerated oddities at best. They couldn't see that in many communities, these figures stood near the center of social life, woven into decision-making, kinship, and daily survival. Respect wasn't grudging acceptance, it was structured. The irony is almost too sharp. In societies where survival depended on interdependence, individuals living between genders were not excluded, but drawn closer. They were given roles, influence, and visibility. Their existence was not an exception to community life, but an axis around which much of it turned. Yet beneath the surface of respect, another layer always lingered, the unease that comes with proximity to power. Reverence shaded easily into suspicion. Communities that elevated two-spirits also feared what might happen if their power turned inward, if balance became disruption. Admiration, in this context, was never free of anxiety, and it was that anxiety that shaped the dangerous side of their sacredness, because when reverence wavered, the same qualities that made them holy could suddenly make them threatening. Respect and suspicion were twins, always born together. Communities honored two-spirit figures for their balance, their breadth of knowledge, their ritual legitimacy, and yet, behind the nods and gifts, there was often unease. Sacredness, after all, wasn't the same as safety. To live between genders was to embody forces that most people couldn't control, and anything beyond control carries its own quiet terror. A successful healing brought relief, admiration, even celebration. But when fevers lingered, when hunts failed, when storms flattened the crops, the question inevitably surfaced: had the healer slipped out of balance? The same mouth that once blessed fields could just as easily be accused of cursing them. Sacredness carried weight, and weight could crush as quickly as it could protect. Stories reinforced this ambivalence. Folklore from several nations included figures whose dual-gender power brought blessings in one tale and catastrophe in another. These stories weren't contradictions. They were warnings. Power was double-edged, and reverence had to be tempered with caution. A two-spirit person could meditate with spirits, but spirits were fickle, and sometimes the messenger became suspect. Even in daily life, suspicion seeped in. If a quarrel broke out between families, people might whisper that the mediator favored one side. If a dream went badly interpreted, resentment could spread. In communities where every action resonated across kinship lines, neutrality was nearly impossible. And for someone already set apart as sacred, every perceived misstep carried exponential consequences. The eerie part is how quickly admiration could flip. One day, the healer was seated beside elders at the feast. The next, they were eyed with unease because a child had died despite their intervention. The very thing that made them indispensable, their role as bridge, also made them the perfect scapegoat when bridges collapsed. Colonial chroniclers occasionally caught glimpses of this tension, though usually by accident. They recorded instances of ridicule or punishment without understanding the fragile balance behind them. To outsiders, it looked like a contradiction. How could someone be revered and mocked at the same time? What they missed was that reverence and danger weren't opposites. They were inseparable. Sacredness itself created the risk. Suspicion also extended to lineage. In societies where kinship ties structured politics, a person outside the ordinary categories could unsettle expectations. If succession depended on clear gender roles, then someone living between them could be seen as a disruption, not because they lacked legitimacy, but because they carried too much of it. Influence concentrated in unusual bodies always makes people nervous. This underlying anxiety was never enough to erase the role entirely, not before colonial suppression intervened, but it was enough to make sacred lives precarious. Reverence was always conditional, renewed only so long as balance was preserved and rituals succeeded. To stumble was to risk falling from an honored figure into suspected danger, and when family, inheritance, and succession entered the picture, the unease only deepened, because nothing unsettled political order quite like someone who lived outside its categories while still shaping its decisions. Kinship was never just about who shared blood. It was the architecture of politics, inheritance, and survival. Families mapped out alliances like chessboards, arranging marriages, trading obligations, and securing heirs. In that careful system, anyone who lived outside standard categories of gender introduced both opportunity and danger. Two-spirit relatives could complicate the neat arithmetic of succession. A younger sibling expected to carry on a lineage might instead be marked for spiritual roles, pulling them away from producing heirs. For families that measured power through children, this shift could spark unease. Sacred responsibility was honored, yes, but it also disrupted dynastic ambition. At the same time, alliances could be reshaped by the presence of a two-spirit figure. To marry such a person wasn't scandal. In many contexts, it was prestigious. A partner linked themselves not only to a family but to sacred legitimacy. That prestige could tilt the balance of influence within extended kin groups. Families with a two-spirit member might find themselves elevated socially, but also resented for holding a resource others couldn't replicate. Succession in leadership roles was particularly fraught. Councils listened to two-spirits because their voices carried ritual authority. But leadership often required clarity of lineage, a son following a father, a daughter carrying on maternal roles. Where categories blurred, succession grew complicated. Could someone between genders be chief? Could their descendants claim legitimacy? Communities answered differently, but the very questions revealed the tensions simmering beneath the surface. These tensions didn't always play out in open conflict. More often, they lingered in whispered debates, in careful sidelong glances at councils, in family members jockeying for influence around someone whose authority outstripped their official role. To carry sacred balance meant being at the center of webs where ambition, devotion, and suspicion all tangled. The irony is that the very traits that made two spirits indispensable, mediation, healing, legitimacy, also made them disruptive to the ordinary flow of inheritance. Families who honored them also sometimes feared the shifts they brought. A sibling elevated as a healer could overshadow a warrior. A marriage alliance blessed by sacred presence could destabilize others. Balance at the cosmological level meant imbalance at the domestic one. Colonial records, predictably, flattened this nuance. Missionaries wrote about confused family arrangements, unable to grasp that what looked unstable to them was, in fact, a delicate negotiation between sacred duty and political continuity. They saw chaos where there was actually adaptation. Still, for the families themselves, the presence of a two-spirit member meant walking a fine line. They were proud, yes, they were also cautious. Reverence didn't erase rivalry, and kinship never let go of ambition. To live between genders was to live within that tension, honored for embodying balance, blamed for unsettling order. And once colonizers imposed their own rigid binaries, those tensions grew sharper. What had once been manageable negotiations within kin networks became targets for suppression from outside. Family dramas gave way to outright violence, as colonial authorities declared entire roles illegitimate, which leads directly into the next layer of danger. The moment when misinterpretation turned into systematic erasure. When Europeans stumbled into indigenous nations, they brought not only guns and trade goods, but an entire worldview welded shut around binaries. To them, gender was fixed, ordained, and unquestionable. Anyone who lived between categories didn't fit into their theology or their civil codes. So rather than try to understand, they branded it dangerous. The earliest colonial writings described two-spirits with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century wrote of men dressed as women and women acting as men, flattening sacred roles into grotesque caricatures. French missionaries added moral outrage, claiming such figures were proof of pagan corruption. What indigenous nations recognized as balance, colonizers reduced to sin or sickness. That misinterpretation quickly hardened into violence. Missionaries singled out two spirits as obstacles to conversion. To admit that such people carried authority meant admitting that indigenous cosmologies had legitimacy, something the church and crown could not allow. So the solution was eradication. Ceremonies were banned, sacred objects burned, and individuals punished or killed for embodying roles that had once been honored. The colonial state soon joined. In the 19th century, laws in both Canada and the United States criminalized dances and ceremonies, directly targeting the spaces where two-spirit authority was most visible. Boarding schools hammered in the message. Children marked as different were shamed, beaten, or forced into rigid roles. Where once a grandmother might have whispered, "marked," a missionary now shouted, "unnatural." The irony is suffocating. Europeans condemned indigenous healers for superstition, while their own doctors were prescribing mercury for coughs and bleeding patients to death. They mocked rituals that restored harmony while practicing medical routines that killed more efficiently than the illnesses. Civilization, as they defined it, often looked like a slow-motion disaster. For indigenous communities, the loss was devastating. Without recognized two-spirit healers, the continuity of knowledge fractured. Rituals once performed openly were forced underground. Families learned to whisper rather than proclaim. The sacred role that had mediated between human and spirit worlds was suddenly cast as liability. Its bearers targeted not just socially but physically, yet fragments survived. Some communities protected their two-spirit members in secrecy, refusing to let colonial erasure erase memory. Stories circulated quietly, practices endured in coded form. The thread didn't snap, though it frayed almost to nothing. And in that persistence lies the unsettling fact. Even at the height of suppression, the colonial project never truly succeeded. Still, the danger was real and ongoing. To live between genders in a world policed by missionaries and officials was to carry a permanent target. Sacredness didn't shield anyone from the violence of laws and whips. What once brought honor now risked punishment. Survival meant secrecy, adaptation, and in many cases, silence. And silence, though heavy, is not the same as disappearance. In the shadows of suppression, the role lived on, biding its time until conditions shifted, until survival strategies could once again become visibility. Suppression never erased the role. It only drove it underground, where memory moved in whispers and gestures instead of open ceremony. Families who once celebrated a child's difference with feasts learned to protect it with silence. Recognition didn't vanish, it became coded. A glance, a muttered phrase, a gift placed discreetly in a child's hands. These were the new rituals of survival. Knowledge endured in fragments. Elders passed on herbal remedies under the cover of teaching ordinary skills. Songs once sung in public were reduced to hums around the fire, carrying syllables stripped of their names, but still pulsing with meaning. Sacred bundles disappeared from view, but reappeared in private moments, unwrapped only for those trusted enough to understand. Every act became an exercise in camouflage. Communities became bilingual in a sense, one language for the colonial authorities, another for themselves. Outwardly, they performed conformity. Inwardly, they maintained continuity. Boarding schools trained children to recite scripture, but at home, grandmothers still muttered the old phrases, half in jest, half in defiance. Two worlds overlapped awkwardly, and in the cracks between them, the role of the two-spirit survived. This survival came at a cost. Living between genders, once celebrated as sacred, now carried real danger. Punishments were brutal, ranging from public humiliation to outright violence. People learned to shield their identities, to conceal what had once been honored openly. Sacredness had not disappeared, but the danger had multiplied. Every step between genders was a step onto contested ground. Yet secrecy also created resilience. To keep traditions alive under threat demanded creativity. Families learned to hide knowledge in places colonizers wouldn't look. Inside stories disguised as children's tales. Inside songs labeled nonsense. Inside practices too ordinary to seem suspicious. These weren't mere survival strategies. They were acts of quiet defiance. The irony was sharp. Colonizers believed they had eradicated the role, congratulating themselves on civilizing communities. Meanwhile, two-spirit knowledge lingered right under their noses, alive in kitchens, in corners of ceremonies, in the hushed exchanges of relatives who refused to forget. Suppression created not extinction, but secrecy, and secrecy bred tenacity. Anthropologists arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally caught glimpses of this hidden continuity. They wrote about curious survivals, noting individuals who seemed to straddle categories despite centuries of suppression. They didn't realize these weren't survivors at all. They were continuations, deliberately maintained in silence. For the people themselves, survival under secrecy was a double burden. They carried the sacred responsibility of balance while also navigating constant danger. Revered in memory, targeted in practice, they became embodiments of contradiction, sacred and endangered, powerful and vulnerable, honored in whispers but denied in public. But secrecy isn't only hiding, it's waiting. And eventually, the waiting ended. When communities began reclaiming ceremonies and traditions in the 20th century, the fragments preserved in silence became seeds of revival. What had once been a dangerous secret grew again into public acknowledgement. And yet, even in revitalization, the danger didn't fully disappear. Living between genders remained sacred, yes, but the risk, shaped by centuries of suppression, lingered. The sacred and the dangerous never fully separated. When the silences finally cracked, what emerged was not a ghost, but a survivor. By the late 20th century, indigenous communities began piecing back together what had been forced underground. Songs outlawed for decades returned to ceremonies. Bundles hidden in trunks were brought back into the light. And alongside this revival, the role of those living between genders, now often named under the pan-tribal term two-spirit, stepped forward again. Gatherings in the 1980s and 1990s gave the revival language. The phrase two-spirit, coined in 1990 at a meeting in Winnipeg, provided a unifying identity across nations while still honoring specific traditions. It gave voice to what elders had whispered for generations, that living between genders was not a mistake, not a curiosity, but a sacred role suppressed by colonial violence. Naming it publicly was both healing and defiance. Ceremonial life shifted with this resurgence. Two-spirit people reclaimed their places as healers, singers, and spiritual leaders. Some returned with knowledge preserved by families. Others reconstructed practices from oral history, ethnographic notes, and fragments passed down in secret. Their presence at the fire was no longer hidden, but celebrated again, though never without echoes of the danger that had once forced them underground. Modern influence extended beyond ritual. Two-spirit leaders became activists, educators, and cultural organizers. They addressed not only ceremonial responsibilities but also the traumas left by colonization. the legacy of boarding schools, the epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women and LGBTQ+ people, the fractured lines of kinship disrupted by centuries of erasure, healing expanded from curing bodies to repairing communities, and yet, the danger remained. Colonial binaries didn't dissolve with a word. Discrimination, violence, and misunderstanding continue to stalk two-spirit lives. Sacred recognition now coexists with systemic risk, honored in some spaces, targeted in others. The sacred and the dangerous remain bound, inseparable threads in the same fabric. The irony is unmissable. For centuries, colonizers tried to erase the role precisely because it was powerful. Today, the very survival of that role proves how central it always was. If it had been marginal, it would not have been so fiercely attacked. Its revival is not just cultural resurgence, but historical evidence. Living between genders was never fringe, it was foundational. Still, revitalization isn't about returning to some frozen past, it's about carrying ancient roles into contemporary contexts. A two-spirit healer might bless a sweat lodge one day, speak at a human rights conference the next, and organize youth workshops on gender identity after that. Continuity doesn't mean unchanged, it means adaptive survival. The eerie beauty is that despite centuries of violence, the sacred logic persists. Duality remains sacred, balance remains medicine, and danger remains a companion. To live between genders today is to inherit both reverence and risk, to walk a path both ancient and urgently modern. The sacred has not lost its edge, and the danger has not disappeared. The story closes where it began, with balance. Living between genders was never simply tolerated or condemned, it was always both. A role elevated to the sacred precisely because it carried danger, and dangerous precisely because it carried the sacred.